Welcome to the Oakwood Historical Society's House Museum. If you've ever driven down Far Hills and had been curious about this house and maybe wondering who the Long-Romspert family was, then join us today to learn more about this fascinating history and the people who lived here. Just a few things. This presentation should not be considered definitive, but as an updated peek into the history of the House Museum. The accounting lies heavily on past society members, written recordings, many oral histories, most of which we have confirmed with historical records when possible. Our goal is to continue our research and to discover even more answers to the still remaining questions and some of the theories that we've had. Right now we're sitting in the original Civil War era parlor, but the home's history starts even earlier than that. And it starts with a man named David Worman, a name that is most likely not very familiar to you. David Worman was one of the first pioneer settlers in what is now known as Oakwood. He arrived about in circa 1806, approximately about the same time as Colonel Robert Patterson settled in Dayton. Worman first settled along the Cincinnati Pike, the area now known as Carmont and Oakwood, in what was possibly one of his first two log cabins. He amassed more than 700 Oakwood acres at one time, buying and selling parcels that would eventually become owned by such renowned Oakwood families, such as the Houcks and Talbots, the Parrots, the Carrs, the Pattersons, and the Shroyers, and what would eventually become the Kramer's Wine and Pleasure Gardens and NCR's Sugar Camp and this Long-Romspert homestead. In looking at this map, now this map was much later, but it's a very interesting map. You could see the Shantz Platte to the right, and you could see the NCR buildings to the north in Dayton. And as you follow along, you'll come down Main Street, you could see where it branches off into Far Hills, then known as Dayton, Centerville, Lebanon Pike. And then off to this area, you'll see the canal. And here is the Cincinnati Pike, which was the main road all the way to Cincinnati. Here in Oakwood, that's now called West Shantz, to give you some bearing. David Worman settled in this top area along the ridge, what we call the bluffs of Oakwood. And you could see all this area, and you could see the people who eventually moved into this area after him. Worman migrated to Dayton from Frederick County, Maryland, in a covered wagon with his wife, Mary, the previously widowed Mrs. Schank, and his stepdaughter, Elizabeth Schank. And if you look at this 1820 census, you will see David Worman up at the top, and you might see a couple other early settlers' names who you recognize, such as Jacob Shroyer, and way at the bottom here, you will see Colonel Robert Patterson. David and Mary had at least 3 more children after arriving in the now Oakwood area, but most notably was his daughter, also named Mary, who lived to be 104 years old. Mary Worman's oral history of her early pioneer life affords us both a fascinating and very rare glimpse into the Worman family's early days in Oakwood, which, according to Mary Worman's historical accounting, David Worman also built a log cabin schoolhouse, but that's another story that we'll get to in another time. In 1816, Worman was granted a land patent by James Madison. In 1837, he received another land grant from Martin Van Buren and is thought to have built his second log cabin on a parcel here along the Lebanon Pike. Although the second cabin, we're pretty sure, may have been built prior to 1822. He also received a land grant in 1812, but we have not found a recording of this, just references to it in our research. And here you will see a copy of the 1837 grant that he received from Martin Van Buren. 2 men that you might now recognize their names, John and Jacob Shroyer, arrived in the Dayton-Oakwood area about 1810, so about 6 years after David Worman arrived, where they met and stayed with the Worman family. And some accountings say that they were introduced by David Cooper, but both families were from Frederick, Maryland, so we're thinking that they at least had some form of introduction from their past. John and Jacob Shroyer, while they were staying with the Wormans, walked the land up near the bluffs of Oakwood with the Wormans, and they really fell in love with the land up there. The hills and the ravines reminded them of their home in Maryland. But there was another reason why John Shroyer may have decided to stay in the Oakwood area, because he became very smitten with David Worman's stepdaughter, Elizabeth Shank, and they got married in 1817. Elizabeth and John soon after returned to Maryland in order to claim the inheritance from her natural father. With this $7,000, they purchased land on the west side of Oakwood from Worman. Now that's a lot of money. So we're like questioning, okay, did she really get $7,000? What is assumed is that her father was also in the American Revolution, and he had received land grants, and Elizabeth was able to claim those land grants and sell them. John Shroyer would not have been able to do that, so they were in Elizabeth's name. They returned to Oakwood. In 1830, the Shroyers purchased land on the east side of Lebanon Pike, near the corner of Far Hills and Hadley, and they built this brick house. Now, descendants of the Shroyers gave us this photo, and they do tell us this was what the original house looked like, but when it was torn down, about the 60s, it had evolved into this house. Unfortunately, yes, it no longer exists. This is an 1851 map, and this is the earliest map we have of this area of Van Buren, and it shows Worman's vast land holdings just a few years prior to his death. The 1850 census lists his real estate value at $11,600. Now this is a great map and a wonderful resource to us. To get your bearings, you follow here on Lebanon Pike, which is now Far Hills, and off to the left is the Cincinnati Pike. And there's a lot of names here of importance to us. Mostly, you know, you see Wade up here in this corner. He was an early pioneer also, and this would be Patterson Road today. This road was once called Wade's Road. You could see the Farver family. They had their farm just off of Patterson Road. You see John Van Cleve there. And these little squares that you see, these signify houses or other substantial buildings worth some money, maybe a large barn. You'll see John Shroyer now and his son, David, they're on the east side now, but you also see the original land that they had purchased from David Worman up by the Cincinnati Pike. You'll see Jacob and another Shroyer there. But we're going to focus here on David Worman. And you could see his vast land ownings, and you could see 3 substantial buildings that he had in 1851. Another note is the tavern you see down there. That is the 4 Mile Tavern, which the Oakwood Historical Society has just installed a historical marker for. But I want you to pay attention to these 3 buildings that belong to David Worman, because we're going to get back to them in a minute. So here is the 1850 census. It shows David Worman, his real estate value, $11,600. Quite substantial over everyone else there. You could see down at the bottom, you don't have anybody near him. He had 170 acres of tillable land, meaning he farmed on, and he had 163 acres of wooded area with ravines. And this is real important because David Worman he didn't really need to farm for his money. He was a man of some means. And from all accounts, he really liked living in the woods. He liked hunting. He liked trapping. So Harriet Shroyer Long, she was born in 1823. She lived across the street from the homestead with her father, John, and her mother, Elizabeth. Hence, her grandmother was Mary Worman, David's wife. Harriet met Henry Long, and they married in 1843. Henry Long was the son of Peter Long. The Long family arrived in Van Buren area about 1828. The Peter Long Historic Home still stands on Laurelwood in Kettering, and it's on the National Register of Historic Places. So after David Worman died, Henry Long purchased the Worman 160-acre tract in 1856 for $3,280. And the Society has in our archives the original deed for this property. There's so many accountings saying he only paid $280, so this was real confusing until we discovered this deed. But it was actually $3,280. Michael Garst had bought the larger David Worman property, and he meant to just to subdivide it. So he sold this particular tract to the Long family. So in essence, this property was Harriet's grandmother's homestead. You know, and like I said, she must have grown up on this property, so it meant some sentimental value to her. So this is the original homestead. The Longs began construction of the original Victorian gable front and wing house during Abraham Lincoln's early presidency, about 1861 to 1863. We don't know for sure why they purchased the land in 1856, but didn't get around to building the house until later. So there is a little bit of confusion there and curiosity. It is considered that the Longs resided in the original Worman log cabin when they were making this house. Now this photo was also given to us by descendants of the Shroyer family, and according to them, this is Harriet Long there in the black and her daughter Laura Long-Romspert. And based on the fact that we know when Harriet died and about when Laura moved back into the house, we could date this photo to about the early 1890s because it tells us the story of the evolution of the house. So early recordings state the home was made out of bricks fired in kilns near Peach Orchard. Now this kiln was on John Shroyer's property, and basically we think that that was the same kiln that built the bricks for his house that you saw earlier over on Hadley. The Longs operated a small farm, a thriving gravel pit, and a peach orchard. And yes, we think that's where the name Peach Orchard Road comes from. There was a large barn. There was a summer kitchen that you could see in the background there with the cupola, a carriage house, and a wood smokehouse, which we're very curious about. And there was also a milk house and an outhouse. The barn was raised about 1928. And again, we'll come back to this photo. The 1860 census lists the Long family residing in a dwelling on Lebanon Pike, but it doesn't give much of a real estate value at that time. The 1870 census, however, lists the Longs residing in the home with their 4 children and a farm laborer. Their second son, William, died prior to 1870 at a very young age. You'll notice on here, Henry is noted as a farmer, and the value of the house goes from $1,000 in 1860 to $24,700 in 1870. Now, in 1860, why his real estate value was at $1,000 when he paid $3,000 for it is still kind of a mystery. We don't know if he sold some of that land. Here's an 1875 map, the next helpful map we have of this area. And you could see coming down, you'll see the village of Oakwood up there at the top in the middle. And you will see Lebanon Pike, Far Hills coming down. You'll also see at this time Van Cleve has left the Oakwood area and the Schaefers have now moved in. And you will see that the Favre farm is now divided up between his 3 heirs. John Shroyer is still there with his. And you will notice that the Parrots have moved in, the Houcks have moved in, and you will also see William Kramer's pleasure garden up in the left-hand corner. Now let's look at Henry Long's property. And you'll notice these 3 same buildings that we saw earlier on the 1851 map under David Worman's name. Now, if you look at this road up here, that would be about where Lonsdale is today, and down where you see the toll gate, that would be where Peach Orchard is. We assume that this little building was the original log cabin that David Worman lived in, but now we know for sure that this building down here by Peach Orchard was the toll gate. Now when I hear toll gate, I think of a small little building with a security guard standing in it, but that's not the case. This was a house with people living in it. So we go back, you'll see those 3 buildings in the 1851 map are about in the same location, and there's the toll house. So if we go back to the 1850 census, you'll see David Worman now, but if you scroll up just about 3 houses, you'll see a name named Peter Reich. His occupation is listed as gatekeeper. And he has a lot of children there, you could see, living with him. Then you will see David Shroyer and you will see David Worman. Now you'll notice just above David Worman, you'll see another Worman, and that was his son Solomon. Now, the real estate value for the gatekeeper and Solomon are 0. That means that that real estate was most likely owned by David Worman at that time. So David Worman was the one who started that toll house and earned the money from it. When David Worman died, he had an estate inventory taken so they could divide up his estate among his heirs. And it's several pages long, and we're still going through it. It's kind of hard to read. But one thing really struck us, that jumped out to us, was that noted that he paid cash for the building of a milk house, a kitchen, meaning to us a summer kitchen here in the north. All the kitchens then were built outside, of course, mostly because of fire hazards. If the summer kitchen caught on fire because they were cooking on these huge hearths, they didn't want the main house to be affected. And there's also a smokehouse. And you could see the kitchen and the milk house was built about 1839, it looks. The summer kitchen and the smokehouse looks like they were built in 1852. Now, does that make the homesteads, kitchen and milk house earlier than we originally thought they were being built? Or were David Worman's milk house, kitchen, and smokehouse torn down and the Longs built new? We don't know that answer yet, but there is a good chance they could date back further than we think. And I apologize for the very blurriness of this photo. This photo, we really had to zoom into it because we thought we could see something in the background there. So to give you your bearings, this road here is actually the homestead's driveway where it curves around the back of the house. And if you were standing down in the right lower corner and put your hand out to the right, you would be touching the back of the summer kitchen. And we're looking straight ahead at the garage there. But when we started zooming in on this photo, we noticed this building back here that we had never noticed before. What is that building? Is that the mysterious smokehouse or wood house that they called? Or is it some other sort of shed or some other sort of barn? Could that be where Solomon lived? We don't know. It does not look like a log cabin, and that's a photo that we're probably going to have to get some experts to try to get in there and let us get a better look at it. After John Shroyer's death, Harriet Long inherited about 92.5 acres of the original Shroyer farm. Henry Long purchased additional acres also on the east side from Harriet's brother. Andrew Shroyer inherited 72 acres from his father, but he wanted to move further south, so he sold that land to Henry. So if you look at this map, again, you can clearly see the Dayton-Lebanon Pike, and you could see the original Henry Long property. Now the property, and that's down to 100 during this map, if you look up above, he sold some land to Henrietta Parrott and to Young. But over on the east side now, you've got Henrietta Long with 92 acres and Henry Long with 72 acres. So they had a massive amount of acreage in this area by the state. Henry and Harriet resided in the home until their deaths in 1896, within 6 months of each other. They are interred at David's Cemetery. When Henry died, he possessed approximately 285 acres in Oakwood, which included the homestead. When they died, the acreage on both sides of Far Hills had to be divided into 4 tracts, one for each child. Now this is an original plat subdivision that was made after their deaths. You can see up here it's dated 1897. The Society has this in our archives. We now have it in a flat drawer, so hopefully those folds will come out. It's very hard to read, but if you look down the center, you can see where Lebanon Pike is. Over here is the homestead. But a past president, the late Harry Ebling, kind of drew up this little map that works out pretty well to explain. As you can see, Lonsdale again there at the top under Henry Long's name, Peach Orchard down at the bottom of the map. And you could see how he divided up that property into the 4 children. You'll also notice Henry Parrott's name up there. He purchased that part of the land in 1883. It was actually Henrietta, so I don't know why Harry put Henry. But if you look at that, that's a really important part. And if you were on our park walk tour last spring, you would have learned the history of this area. You could see Foyer Road there in Henrietta's land. She named that road Foyer after her grandfather, Samuel Foyer, who was a very esteemed engineer and built most of the canals in Ohio, including the canal here in Miami Valley. And that's also where Elizabeth Gardens is. She named that park when she donated it to the city for her mother. That was all originally David Worman's land. So maybe we could be thankful to David Worman that he really liked the woods and appreciated the land and kept it as it was so naturally. James Young purchased that part from Henry about 1894. And that little road is now Park Road, but it was once called Young's Road to give him access into his farm area. If you look at the top, Emma Conover, she was the second oldest daughter, and she inherited that portion of Oakwood. And this is about where now Wright Library sits and Smith School. The oldest sister, Mary Lafleur Wiley, she was widowed from Lafleur early on and then married Wiley. She moved further south, and I haven't really researched her a lot since she left Oakwood, but we'll get to her soon. But down here is where it gets interesting. Peter Long was the oldest son, and Luella was his wife. Well, apparently Peter and his parents had a little bit of well, let's just say they had a disagreement. And Henry and Harriet, when they wrote their wills, was a little concerned that Peter might be divorcing his wife, which he did eventually. So Henry left a certain part to Peter, but he also left a certain part directly to Luella Long, and that was probably to protect her and his grandchildren. And as we all know, Laura Long-Romspert, she was the youngest, and we'll get to her because she's kind of the star of this house. She inherited the homestead. She was the youngest, a young widow with 2 young children, so her parents probably thought she needed the house and the security. Let's go to Peter Baker Long. Of course, he lived in this house. He helped build it. And as I said, he was the eldest. And when he and Luella married, Henry Long moved the former toll house to the corner of Triangle and Lebanon Pike for Peter and Luella as their wedding home. And this is a photo of what it kind of looked like at that time. And I think it's just terribly enchanting. It still stands on Triangle after it was moved a second time from its Far Hills facing location to face Triangle. It's still there today. It does not look like this anymore. But I do want to mention, as an aside, Peter and Luella's granddaughter, which would be Harriet and Henry Long's great-granddaughter, was Margie Mack Yao. She was very involved in the Oakwood Historical Society, but she spent many childhood years growing up on Triangle after her own mother, Ruth Long Mack, inherited the home. The Mack subdivision is named for Ruth Mack, dating back to the original Long property. The society receives an annual sum from an endowment in honor of Ruth Long Mack. So I find it very touching that the Long house is still being supported by the Long family today. Here's another photo of the Peter Long house. Just lovely roof line, just lovely. You can see how blank it is in the background. And this, we think, is Peter Long. We haven't made sure of that yet, but we're pretty sure this is Peter Long. This came to us from Margie Mack, and this was probably the raising of the barn after he got married and the house was moved to Triangle. So Emma Long Conover, she was the second oldest daughter of Henry and Harriet, and she married Ellis Conover in 1871. Ellis Conover, he was a retail merchant, and he owned a grocery store in downtown Dayton, which was unfortunately destroyed during the flood. But this is their farmhouse that was right across the street where Wright Library is now. And this is what the back of her house looked like. One of the reasons I'm showing you this photo is to give you a sense of what Oakwood and this part of Oakwood was like at the time, besides the fact this is a wonderful old photo showing their barn, the back of the house, the water tower. But this was like a little compound. You had Peter Long right down there, you had Emma across the street, and that by now you had Laura here, and they all had the barns, etc. So it's like, and this part, at least the homestead, did not become part of Oakwood until about 1928. So now Laura. As I mentioned, Laura was the youngest daughter of Henry and Harriet. She was widowed from Alexander Romspert in 1892. He was only 38 years old and was a very rising young attorney in Dayton, Ohio. They had 2 children at the time of his death, Maud, age 9, Harry, age 4. And this is Laura with her 2 children. And based on what you can guesstimate the children's ages at the time, this would have been a year or so after Alexander's death. You could see Laura there in her black mourning crepe and Harry and Maud. After Alexander's death, they returned to the homestead, and Laura took care of her parents right upstairs here in the homestead in their later years. Laura proved to be a very astute businesswoman, and as a young widow, she began a lucrative career in real estate. One oral history claims she was on her way to become a millionaire before the Depression hit. You know, when I first read this early on, I thought, okay, that's got to be, you know, a big exaggeration. But after really looking into all of her finances and looking into her contracts that she made with people, I don't really think it's that far off the mark. She sold parcels of her inherited homestead property to Capel, John Patterson, etc. I mean, she was a young woman wheeling and dealing with these big-time people in Dayton, Ohio. She began investing that money in both existing and new homes, both in Dayton and the emerging Oakwood Village. She owned many rental homes, including on East Dixon, Wisteria, Hadley, and Foyer. Here's a copy of one of her later contracts that she made with Capel, and you could see the sum on just this contract alone is like $160,000. According to legend, at a very young age of 7, Laura insisted on helping her family in the building of the original homestead by carrying the bricks from the wagon to the work site, 1 brick at a time. So she had a big help in this. And there she is in later years, standing in front of her garden. She financed and planned the 1917 to 1923 edition, along with several earlier additions to this house. It was basically her home from its very beginnings to her death, a span of over 80 years that saw tremendous change in both the homestead and the Oakwood community, from its rural farmland to its suburban beginnings. This is one of my favorite, I keep saying this, but this is one of my favorite photos of the homestead. We don't see the back of it in so many. So to get your bearings, you could see where the driveway curves around to the back of the house. It's still there in that same footprint. There's another driveway coming off to the north of the property here. We're standing just north of the house facing south. So you will see the carriage house. To the right, you will see the barn, the very large barn that was torn down again about 1928. And you will see the summer kitchen, which still exists. It had 2 chimneys back there. You'll see the cupola. Now, about the turn of the last century, the summer kitchen ceased being really a summer kitchen, and it became what they called the wash house. So that's where they did their clothing, and you could see them with all their long johns hanging out there. They also, interestingly enough, and I always heard this, and I never understood how this could happen, but they had the summer kitchen on one side, and they housed small, young animals on the other side of the kitchen at one time during the winter months. You know, they'd bring in colts, maybe lambs, and this is how they did it. So this is a vintage photo of the summer kitchen. You could see the large hearth, which is still there. You could see it had a dirt floor. They put in wood planks to keep the mud, but they had this old door there. And on the other side of that door is where they kept the small livestock. Here's another photo of Laura's large barn. That is her carriage and her horse. Her horse's name was Ben, and that's her carriage driver. His name was Lewis, and he would come a couple times a week and take Laura on her errands to pick up her rent checks from all of her many rental properties. We have one oral history of one of her nephews fondly recalling riding in that carriage during the summer months with his Aunt Lowell, he called her, and Amelia, which was a longtime resident here also. And they would travel around, they'd go into Dayton, they'd pick up all the rent checks, and then they'd swing by the arcade, the downtown Dayton arcade on the way home, and they'd all get ice cream for the ride home. Here's another photo from a different side. We're looking at the north side of the house here. And based on the ages, this is Laura sitting in the front, and that's her daughter Maud, and her son Harry sitting down. And kind of based on what we guess could be their age at that time, this would have been taken right about the turn of the century. There's some things going on with the house here that we'll get in later. But this gentleman over here standing off to the side, that is Michael Bartch. That family had moved in by now. The house next door, right to the north of this house, 1945 for hers. Laura built that home next door in 1902 for her newly married daughter, Maud. Maud had married Roy Cole, but they divorced prior to 1905, and she married Guy Shroyer in 1909. Now, if you look at this house, this was not an inexpensive house to build, even during those times. So Laura was a pretty well-to-do woman. Here's another photo from the front of the house. So Maud sold the home back to Laura in 1905. After her divorce, Roy Cole released the dower because back then, you know, when you got married, the real estate kind of went into the man's name. So he kindly released the dower, and Laura claimed ownership of it again. We don't know when Laura sold it to Harry, but Harry apparently sold it back to Laura in 1910 for $1, just prior to his own marriage. So Laura learned really quick from Maud's earlier divorce. She wasn't taking a chance losing this house when Harry got married. The house remained in her name until her death. This photo was taken about 1908. It was probably around Harry's 20th birthday, in front of maybe what was then his new house and his 1906 car. We have a registration of that car, the Roadster, and that was probably also a gift from his mother. Now, Maud Shroyer, she was born in 1883, and she died in 1946, just 3 years after her mother Laura's death, which is really sad. Maud and Shroyer had two daughters, Catherine Smith and Charlotte Myers. And both of these young daughters, they lived to an advanced age. Charlotte Myers died in the 1990s, Catherine in the early 2000s. And we have a lot of correspondence, well, not a lot, but we have some correspondence from Catherine in her later years, giving us some nice insights into her mother Maud, her grandmother Laura. And this is Maud with her horse. You could see the summer carriage in the background. Maud and Guy moved into Laura's rental properties on West Dixon and Wisteria in the early 1920s, and that was so their daughters could attend the Oakwood School on Central Avenue. That is now Harmon School, Harmon Elementary. And remember, this probably wasn't Oakwood at the time, so maybe they moved because Oakwood schools were even great back then. But most of it is because of the distance from here to the school at the time. Here's a lovely photo of Maud with her horse, Jenny, and the barn in the background. Harry Hamilton Romspert, he was known as Hab to his family, and he moved back into this homestead after his father Alexander's death. It is very well documented that Harry suffered from a speech impediment, and it was a kind of a difficult speech impediment, and there was few people who could really understand him from what we know. He is listed in the 1910 census as residing in Cincinnati and going to school. He apparently wanted to follow in his father's footsteps and study law. He only stayed there for about a year before he returned here, though, and married Ethel. So Laura's will. When Laura passed away, she left 4 properties to her daughter and 4 properties to her son. She left a house on Wisteria and Dixon where her daughter was living at the time. She left a double house, and she left what was called a cement house on South Broadway in Dayton. To Harry, as most of you know, she left 2 houses and a double, and she left the house next door, and she left this homestead to him. We were curious about what this cement house was on South Broadway, and here's a photo of it. Gorgeous house. But what's really interesting is this is the house that Laura and Alexander Romspert lived in during their early marriage. They built this house. Their 2 children, Maud grew up in this house until she was 9 years old, so she left this house to Maud. It's a beautiful house. Unfortunately, it doesn't exist anymore. But what strikes me about it is this sentimental attachment that Laura must have had to this house. She held on to this house for 50 years. And is this the house that inspired her to go into real estate? It could have been. And she left it to her daughter, who would have remembered the house most. Laura was also, even though she was an astute businesswoman, she was kind. After she sold the property to William Capel, the Depression hit. And he couldn't really pay back. And she didn't want to lose her deal with him. So she redid another contract with him, allowing him to get his footing after the Depression. And she protected this, and she even told her 2 children in her will that any claim that she had at the time of her death against William Capel for 3 years thereafter, to give him time to realize his holdings purchased from me and not to cause any sacrifice to him or my estate. So she was a nice lady. So now the Bartches arrive. John Michael Bartch, a very talented carpenter, and his family of 3 daughters arrived in the Dayton area from Pennsylvania about 1888. Elizabeth Bartch, his wife, had died earlier, just a year after the birth of their youngest daughter, Lucretia. Michael's oldest child and only son was George Washington Bartch, and he had migrated to the Dayton area earlier after he got married. And you will see here there's Michael Bartch standing in the middle, his daughter Amelia, his oldest daughter, his daughter Emily, and over here you have Lucretia. And standing next to her is Maud Romspert. And those 2 became very close because they were about the same age when the Bartches moved in. It was very common for people to have boarders back then. People were thrifty. They didn't, if they had a spare room, they put it to use. And plus you have to remember, you know, there was wars going on, there was a housing shortage of people needed. This went on in Oakwood through World War II. The Bartch family moved in with the son George for a short period of time before they appear on Lebanon Pike. And it shows the 4 of them. Amelia was the oldest, and she probably was thrust into adulthood very young, taking care of her younger sisters when she was only 9 years old. Also, interesting, in the 19th census, when they are living in this house, they had a nephew and niece living with them. John Michael is thought to have assisted Laura in running the gravel pit farm and her rental properties, but he also had a thriving business with his son, George Bartch. It was called Bartch & Son in Dayton. Bartch is credited with designing and constructing the cupola, the belfry of David's church. He was a trustee, a deacon, and a lifetime member of that church. It's very debonair looking men. Unfortunately, the son, George Washington, died in 1895, shortly after they arrived here. He was only 28 years old. And this may be the reason why the niece and nephew were residing in the homestead during the 19th census. However, all through the years, it appears that many young relatives at the Bartches, nieces, nephews, grandnieces, nephews, as time went on, would come and spend a couple weeks here at the homestead because they thought it was like going to the country. And this side of the house was known as the Bartch side of the house. You could see the cupola in the back on the summer kitchen and the carriage house. And we think this is Lucretia off here to the side taking care of the kids. This is another early photo. You could see Laura standing there. Next to her is Maud. Harry's at the bicycle. Then you've got Lucretia, Michael Bartch, and Amelia. Based on the ages of the 3 younger children, we would say this is the late, maybe the turn of the century. You could see the 2 younger girls are in shorter dresses, which was custom for younger women at that time. But you'll also notice this area back here is no longer an open porch, which probably dates that kitchen that we like to refer to as 1908 a little bit earlier, maybe the turn of the century. Here's another beautiful photograph with a big barn in the background. You can actually see how large it was. Michael Bartch, there's Harry, there's Laura, Amelia, and then you've got Lucretia Bartch and Maud Shroyer riding in the carriage. Michael Bartch died in 1918. Oral histories allude to Amelia attending to him during his illness. He's interred at David's Cemetery, and there you could see the beautiful cupola that he designed and built. 1920 census lists the Bartch family also living here, but they list Amelia, and this is an important part. They list Amelia as the head of the household, and she was age 44 at the time her sister Lucretia was living with her. Lucretia was a working woman, briefly employed at NCR, but mostly noted throughout the years as a dental assistant. In 1920 census, Laura Long-Romspert is also listed as head of her household and at a separate address, even though they were both in the same house, and she is living there with Harry and Ethel. So Amelia Bartch, as I mentioned, she was only 9 years old when her mother died, and she probably had to start taking care of her younger sisters. Her youngest sister had only been like 1 at the time. But Amelia, possibly with an inheritance from her fathers, purchased 7 acres on Peach Orchard, and there you can note her. You could see her right there with 7.5 acres on this map, right along Peach Orchard and Lebanon Pike. So we think that this is how the Bartches and the Longs first met, and then the Romsperts. We have at the Society the Bartch mailbox, which shows that they did actually have their own, and we hope to have this on display. But throughout Laura's lifetime, the Bartch family seemingly lived as though this part of the home was their property. Through oral histories and some records, it just appears the two families lived happily together. Amelia is also credited by many oral histories of taking care of both Laura and Lucretia when they died. They both died in 1943, Lucretia of cancer. And here's Amelia with her chickens in the back of the homestead. She was pretty famous in Oakwood for her lovely chickens, and she would sell chickens and eggs, and you can see how nice they look. Laura also had some chickens, but many oral histories say Laura's chickens were always running around with just half their feathers. So at some point, Laura gave up her chickens and let Amelia run the show. So this is the Bartch addition. You could see this area is the 1860s part of the house. This area was built probably by Michael Bartch to be their dining room, and this area back here to be their kitchen. This particular window no longer exists. That would have been just their mud room, and the kitchen would have been just to the side of this. And then that's Amelia's dog, Mac. There were other boarders here. As I mentioned earlier, you just didn't let a spare room go to work. And Isabella Jameson is probably one of the more well-known of these boarders. And these are pictures of her outside of the homestead here. And you could see the trolley in the background running down Far Hills behind her. It's hard to see, so here's a closer look at it. Since Lucretia and Isabel both worked downtown, they would wait at the side door and wait to see the trolley run south to the turnaround, and then they would walk across the tracks on Far Hills and catch it when it turned the loop and started headed back into Dayton. Harry met Ethel Gilbert when they both attended high school here in the nearby area. They got married in 1910. The couple moved into Laura's home, this home, soon after their marriage, and the addition for their own private living quarters began construction around 1917. We know that it was completed completely by 1923 because we have a lot of receipts that Laura paid to the carpenters, etc., but the final stucco was put on this house in 1923. Occupancy at the homestead must have been really big about that time period, with everybody living here and nieces and nephews of the Bartches coming to visit, etc., and all the construction going on. Harry and Ethel both enjoyed music as a hobby. Harry had a special fondness for cars and writing music lyrics. Ethel for gardening, theater, and poetry. This is a copy. We have a lot of sheet music where the lyrics are noted to be written by Harry Hamilton Romspert. Harry managed his mother's rental properties and assisted also with the gravel pit. He actually managed the gravel pit up until the gravel pit equipment became mechanized, and he decided it was time for him to retire at that point. Here are some of his cars. He was a very dapper looking man in all the photographs we see of him. A good looking man. Remember, he did have that speech impediment, so he was very, very shy and somewhat introverted. Here is Ethel. She is standing in front of what we think was Amelia's garden at that time, and you can see the back of the house there. Ethel was involved in the Dahlia Society, and the lower photo is of her standing in front of some of the dahlias with her co-members. This would have been Amelia's garden, Ethel's garden with the beautiful dahlias. So Ethel, she was born Mary Ethel Elizabeth Gilbert in 1889 outside of Germantown. Her great-great-great-great-grandfather was Reverend Andrew Zeller of Germantown. Zeller founded the First United Brethren Church west of the Alleghenies, and he's pretty well known in the Germantown area, and Ethel remained in the UB Church her entire life. She attended Otterbein College. She was the only one that ever lived in this house, besides that year that Harry went to law school, that actually graduated from college. She attended Otterbein College for 2 years and then transferred to the Dayton Normal School. This was a teacher's college. She graduated in 1910, but she did not ever teach because back then female teachers couldn't be married. And since she got married that same year she graduated, so she did not teach. She was involved, like I said, in the Dahlia Society, the Federation of Clubs and the Women's Clubs, and the Alert Club. Now, I had to look up what the Alert Club was, but it was a literary club, mostly poetry. After Laura's death in 1943 and Amelia's immediate departure afterwards, and this is kind of a sad period of history for the homestead, Ethel was really not happy with Amelia residing in this home. So soon after Laura's death in 1943, she insisted that Amelia leave. Amelia was 68 years old at the time and had lived at the house for 45 years. While Harry was always reclusive, Ethel became more and more reclusive as the time went on. And during these years, the homestead kind of started into a slow decline. Harry passed away in 1969. They are both buried at the Romspert plot at Woodland Cemetery. Harry seemingly never really forgave Ethel for Amelia's sudden departure. To quote the late Harry Ebling, Harry kind of got his revenge and left a large portion of his estate to the nearest living Romspert male relative. Ethel was required to appeal the will and made a settlement with the then Rimland family to gain control back of the property. Without other heirs or close family, Ethel deeded the homestead and the property next door at 1945 Far Hills to the Oakwood Historical Society in 1984. And there's her signature that we have giving us the deed of the house. Ethel passed away about a year later at the age of 95. She had resided in the homestead for 75 years, 16 of those last years all by herself. So you could kind of imagine a woman living in on this huge property with all the outbuildings, an old house like this, by herself at age in the 90s, trying to take care of it. It's really kind of an impossible task. So this is kind of what it looked like from the front when the society took it over. We have recordings that some of the Oakwood kids would run by and think the house was haunted. It was covered with honeysuckle. This is what the garage looked like. So we've done a lot to take care of this over the years and get it back into the condition that it needs to be in. This was the summer kitchen. You can notice the termite damage, etc. More of the summer kitchen. So very quickly, if you're still with me, thank you for staying, but we're going to talk real quickly about the evolution of this house. So if we look at this photo again, we'll see a couple things. Harry Ebling also did this map several years ago, and you could see the outline. It shows the footprint of the house currently, and then the darker lines indicate the original 1860s portion of the house. We're sitting here in this area, which is the original parlor. The summer room is over here, and then you would have their dining room. This area back here was originally this open porch that you see off in the photograph. This front doorway would have been right in this area, and this original front doorway is still existing and is still the same place over here. This is the area that was built in to enclose the kitchen in about the turn of the last century. It was later expanded, probably with the introduction of plumbing in 1910s. This area back here was added on, and this was the Bartch addition, probably again at the turn of the century. And this area in the back would have been their kitchen. That was the mudroom that I showed you earlier with the window. And so you could take off all your muddy clothes, hang them up before walking into that proper house. This would have been the kitchen. And this was a shared pantry between the Bartch family and between Laura's family, the Romspert family. You'll notice the stairs going up, and they're going up in this direction, going up to the second floor. those were turned around when the Bartches moved in. The Romsperts and the Bartches had completely separate. It's kind of like almost thinking of a double house, had completely different. You'll notice this cute little window up here. If you walk outside, you will see that window still there. So here's an interesting thing that has confused us for quite a while, confused us historians here at the Society over the years, but we think we finally got this figured out. So we're going back to this photo, and I love this photo, and this was a recent photo that we discovered because it shows the rear side of the south side of the house, and we hadn't really had privy to that. You'll see the summer kitchen in the back with the cupola and the carriage house. The barn would be just slightly further to the left. Now, I'm kind of a tree hugger, but I'm really annoyed at this tree right here right now because it's hiding a crucial part of the house behind it that would give us even more clues. But the photo gives us a lot of clues. You'll notice that that's a window in this earlier photo. And in this photo, it's a door. So how did those windows get on the side of the house? This parlor currently has 2 windows, and we've had these windows inspected by window restorations, and they're like, those are original 1860 windows. We're like, well, how come they're not in this photo? How did they get there? Well, when the Bartches moved in, to claim their own residence, they needed a front door facing the main street. So they put this front door in. You could see the steps leading up to it, and so that window that is there now got moved to there. So that explains the original 1860 windows there and how they got moved from no windows to windows. Now, where did the second one get to? We'll get there. But now this gave the Bartches their own front door. So there's a few theories of the second floor, but I think we're pretty confident that we've got the right theory now. See this photo? See that window there? This section is totally transformed when they put in the 1917. So we think when the house was expanded to the north, that window became the other window right here. So that explains the 2 windows and why we have windows now that date back to 1860. So this was thought for a long time to be the original. The thicker walls was thought to be the original footprint of the second floor. You can see the steps still lead up from this way. They are now turned around. And that would make sense. This would have been the original master bedroom, and that would have been built for Henry and Harriet Long. And you could see they originally had a window in their bedroom up there on the second floor. That window would have been right there. It's no longer in existence. That's still a very light and airy room. It still has 3 windows though. But you could go up into that room and you could see on the wall where the impression of that window. Also, this room had a window there. That window had to be removed also when the addition was put on. But what's interesting is we are convinced that this area back here, this back room, was part of the original 1860 house. If you go outside and study, you'll see the gable L, the bricks, even though we can't see the bricks anymore because they're stucco over them, but the bricks in the old photos look as though they match. So we think this would have been one room. So you would have come up the stairs this way, you would have gone into this room, then this would have been another room for children, maybe even the farm laborer, etc. So this area over here was put on when Ethel and Harry got married, and that became their private rooms, kind of like their own little suite. So if you look at the back of the house, this area here would have been the area that was put on for Michael Bartch. So that was an addition, probably right at the turn of the century, 1900. And that, where the gable L is, would have been part of the original. You can also see down below, this would have been the side porch that was open originally, and it was enclosed to this area, and then it was expanded into this area. And you can actually go into that old kitchen and actually see how it expanded. The Bartch kitchen no longer resembles what it did at one time. And that's what we look like today. The Society is really proud to have been stewards of this lovely homestead for over 40 years. We can't thank enough all the volunteers who have dedicated so many countless hours over these years in preserving and maintaining this house. If you would like to help us in our mission, please contact us at info@oakwoodhistory.org. And thank you for joining us today.